The woman thought back to the first victims of the plagues. The first people had begun to die after this summer of storms, and they had many different symptoms. Most times the deaths were quick, but the suffering before death was always gruesome. Through the following winter, they burned everything they could burn to keep warm. But food was scarce, and they mostly ate rats and the rare dog or cat. In the warm heat of the spring, the swamp soup began to incubate, and a mysterious mix of germs began to move through the cities and towns and countryside faster. Their hosts were the hordes of mosquitoes, rats, and cockroaches who had been around for millions of years, and some of them moved through the air with the breeze. The number of deaths increased, until soon, if you were the only person left in the household, you were considered to be lucky. Many who never got sick died from starvation, and by the end of the summer of plagues, when the germs had run their course and moved on, it became the most common cause of death. It was at this time that the dark man, known as Bath, came among them. The woman fingered the scar on her left shoulder as she thought about him. She felt the NR that had been branded there after she had tasted the blood in the flesh. The dark man had taught them how to cleanse the bodies of the newly dead by wrapping them in wet burlap and throwing them in the fire. He had also taught them to drink the blood, telling them that it would keep them healthy during the cleansing of the world. And as they had tasted the forbidden food, the words for the ritual had been hauntingly familiar. Bast's words were burned into their brains. "This is my body, take it and eat in remembrance of me. This is my blood, take it and drink in remembrance of me." And then he was gone. He had told them that soon after the cleansing of the world, they would have to move south to join him at the Big Chimney Rock, and they would call themselves the New Rebels. He had also told them that they would know when the time to leave had come, and that they would know the way. They had thought at the time that they would join him soon, but the months passed, and after a while, the dead were fewer. They were no longer starving, and soon the brand became a standard mark to show they were a group. Children, as young as 3, were fed the flesh and the blood and branded. Then, with the fewer deaths, they began to be hungry again. The rats were scarcer now, and they decided that anybody who was not branded with the new rebel mark was an enemy, an animal, and thus game. It was soon after this that they began to collect the occasional traveler, the thieves, and the cheating mate. On the first anniversary of the Dark Man's appearance among them, they drew lots among the families with children and made a sacrifice. They each got a swallow of the blood and a bite of the flesh. Her head still stood in the head graveyard, staring blankly at eternity, and strangely, her eyes had remained intact. The woman's stomach turned at the thought of this, and she moved away from the group for a while, refusing to participate in the ritual. Finally, she had moved back, but had taken no blood and very little flesh, and had become thinner and thinner. She became an expert at trapping the moles that seemed to thrive behind the apartment building where she was living. Even though they weren't really tasty, she had become used to them, and she survived on this diet, along with the few weeds she was able to collect. And then, almost a year later, but before the next anniversary of the Dark Man's appearance among them, River Rat, the group's leader, had announced that he had a dream and it was time to go south in about 2 weeks. Not all of the members of the true way of the new rebels wanted to leave, and those few, along with the few who had gone astray, were collected and locked in a gym with 24-hour guards to await the pilgrimage. They knew they were the animal stock and the food. Mostly the mood was one of hopelessness. They numbered around 50. A day before the pilgrimage was to begin, the lone wolf had come into town. He had been captured almost immediately, or had allowed himself to be captured. He looked strong. His hair was short, and it was the lightest blonde. He had no facial hair and a strong chin. The woman had guessed he was close to 7 feet tall. He looked maybe in his 30s or 40s, but sometimes he looked like a teenager. His eyes were the deepest blue, and they were bottomless. To her at that moment, he looked larger than life. Within hours, he had broken from the gym. At first, it was if he was just sitting and waiting for the right time, the right minute, the right second. When the time came in his head, he was immediately in action, killing the guards with his bare hands. They did not make a single sound. Silently, he collected his pack and guns and some extra ammunition and told them to go west toward the mountains as fast as they could travel. The newly freed prisoners had left almost immediately, arming themselves with some weapons that had been stored in the former locker room. The woman had traveled with them for a few hours, and they never heard sounds of pursuit. Then she began to lay back, thinking. She thought for about an hour and then made her decision. Now she was following the lone wolf. She didn't know his name, but it wasn't important. She felt bound, compelled. She thought she was in love with him, and she had a deep feeling inside that he was going the same place as the new rebels. She also knew that he had decided he was their enemy, and in her heart, she knew that she was their enemy too.